My name is Catherine Bliss. I'm the Associate Director at the Restorative Lab based here at Dalhousie University's Schulich School of Law. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone here to the first in our 2023 Fellows and Associates Seminar Series. This is our second annual seminar series, last year being our inaugural one. So we're excited to launch this year's series with Ali's presentation on a restorative approach in healthcare. And I have the pleasure of just sort of, for those who might be new to the Restorative Lab, my pleasure to sort of get to introduce this series and to tell you a little bit about the lab and the work that we do. So the Restorative Lab came into being in 2020, and we're, as the name suggests, we're the Restorative Research, Innovation, and Education Lab. We are a place and space, both sort of in person here at the physical lab where I am, and virtually where people come together to do work in and around restorative justice. So we have both sort of a presence here locally in Nova Scotia, nationally across Canada, and we work with many partners internationally as well. So it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here to the first in this series. So these Fellows and Associates lectures are part of the community of Fellows and Associates that we host every year here at the lab. So every year we have sort of a new group of Fellows and Associates who come and create a community of work and practice together, who work in different areas, all focused on a restorative approach, whether it's to healthcare, as you'll hear Ali talk about, but people who work in other fields as well come, and it creates a really wonderful place and space for them to collaborate and sort of enrich their own work as well. So we're pleased to host this wonderful community of individuals and be able to spotlight the work that they do each year through these seminar series annually. So I will pass it over to Jacob Glover, who will introduce our speaker.
Ali is a PhD student in the School of Nursing at UBC Okanagan, where she studies the contributions that a restorative approach stands to make in the healthcare context. Ali, having experienced harm as a patient, ended her career as a licensed practical nurse, and this experience, as well as her experience as a former healthcare provider, provides her with this unique lens that she brings to the space and to her discussion tonight. Ali believes that transformation and reimagining of our healthcare system requires a collaborative effort in identifying a principled approach to serve as a foundation for doing so. Ali lives in the lands of the Schulich people in beautiful Coldstream, British Columbia. So I'd like to welcome, or I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer first to introduce the project that Ali will be talking about.
Great. So welcome everyone. I'll add my third note of welcome. So excited to see a small but mighty crew with us here online, and knowing that it's so important that we have you gathered with us online, because it allows us to have a community within which we're able to have and host this talk, and then to be able to post that knowing that we've been surprised, really pleasantly surprised, by the number of people who join us then later by watching and making use of these videos as an ongoing resource to come to be connected to some of the exciting and cutting edge work that the Fellows and Associates are engaged in. And so we're really pleased tonight, for example, to have Holly Northam, who was the visiting international fellow at the lab last year, and now Donna Coker, who is the international visiting fellow this year. It's been an exciting and rich community. So thank you all for braving your supper hour with us, for many of you where you are, and especially to Ali for being willing to come and share your wisdom and knowledge with us tonight. One of the things I'll say, and then I won't steal any of your material, Ali, by introducing the topic or your project, but to say how incredibly exciting it is to watch someone who is so driven by the importance and significance of bringing knowledge and putting it into action to make a real difference, not only in improving the systems, but focusing centrally on the experience of those who are being cared for and who are within the care system, to imagine what well-being and health and care actually require, not only in the face of healthcare harm, but in terms of how to create sort of a just approach to those kinds of systems and services that we need, and how we show up for one another in those systems and services. And so what's exciting, as you heard in Ali's bio, and what has been so formative and informative for those of us at the lab as we learn along with her, is not only the experience that she brings personally from working within healthcare and having experienced healthcare harm, but also that deep commitment to bringing knowledge into action, right? To marrying that connection between knowledge and practice in a way that's so key for innovation. And so that's kind of what we're most committed to and most excited by at the lab, what brings us all together. And so we're all here together tonight, Ali, excited to hear and learn along with you, and glimpse a possibly more just future through your eyes. So I'll turn it over to you with a lot of gratitude for spending your time with us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. And if it's okay, I'll start to share my screen. I think I can do that. There we go. Wonderful. And it's just amazing to see some familiar faces in the audience. I'm just thrilled to be here.
And Ali, I'm just going to tell you that we will have disappeared on your screen and everybody else's screen because we've spotlighted you in the slides at this point. But we will, when you stop sharing your screen, we can all reappear and you can see our faces for some discussion and question and answer. So I'll invite that when you're finished, and invite others to be jotting down their questions or comments or insights so that we can all share those together when you're done.
Oh, please. And I have actually figured out how to see you all on my screen. I think I can get away with this. So it's always nice to see faces, isn't it? So I really appreciate everybody's got their cameras on. So that's wonderful. And thank you for the introduction. So I'll not do that again. But I just want to first start off by acknowledging that the lands that I'm coming to from are the lands of the Silks Okanagan people. I live in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, where I'm an uninvited guest here on these lands. And I also just really wanted to put a shout out to my colleagues at the Restorative Lab. It has been such a pleasure getting to know these people and to be able to work together. Restorative people are just amazing. And I've just felt, so embraced and inspired and, to be with my people. So thank you so much for that. So as mentioned, I'll be talking about a restorative approach in the context of healthcare. And when I was preparing this, it really wasn't difficult to find a lot of articles to demonstrate the state of our healthcare system at the moment. I think I could have done 100 slides like this. That's how it felt as I was going through, but I really wanted to just showcase kind of the scale of harm, the breadth of harm. I know when I first came into this space, it really was a personal journey, which has really kind of evolved over time when my eyes have really been opened to just how much harm we're seeing in how many spaces. So I just want to draw attention to the different ways that we can be thinking about harm in the healthcare system. So really just leaning into like even what's happened just weeks ago in Nova Scotia with the death in the emergency room, lots of patients not being able to get the care that they need and some people dying as a result of. We saw in BC in particular, the In Plain Sight report, which came out, I believe it was November of 2020, which talked about the incredible incidence of Indigenous specific racism in our healthcare system. And that's an interesting story for some who may not know kind of how that came about. And this was our Minister of Health learned that there were some games that were being played in the emergency room, which was, let's guess, the blood alcohol level of the Indigenous patients that were coming in, which horrified him. And they underwent an inquiry and just found that, the incidence of Indigenous specific racism in our healthcare system there's a lot. We've also seen through COVID, lots of harm, particularly with respect to places like long-term care, our healthcare workers are burned out big time. It's very distressing, and I think we're dealing with a lot of the burnout, but also the moral distress piece where people aren't able to show up at work and deliver the care that they want to, and that there's a harming event as well there. So yes, just make me. Did I miss anything? No, so I think we can move on. So, in thinking about this space and with my experience as well, was really this kind of learning about how it's not just the harm that you experience, like with me in particular, it was a misdiagnosis, a cancer misdiagnosis, which precipitated a surgery that I really didn't need, which caused a significant degree of harm. But what was really kind of striking for me was how the system responded to the harm. And so we've really been thinking a lot about this idea of compounded harm. So this particular article that I'm citing here is one that I was involved in, which was an international collaborative between Jo Whaling, who is in New Zealand, and she's a clinician scientist, and then myself as both I think I just started my PhD when we were working on this, but as a master's student, and then a colleague in the UK who also would identify as a harmed patient, and Professor Jane O'Hara, who is a professor in patient safety at Leeds University in the UK. And the other harmed patient her name doesn't show up on here, but is Joanne Hughes, who has founded Harmed Patients Alliance in the UK. So we're all really kind of working together to try to see what we can do in this restorative space in the context of harm in the healthcare system and this compounded harm in the healthcare system. So maybe you may have had the opportunity to read it, but I'll just quickly read this out loud. So when an incident occurs, so we're talking specific to, some sort of an adverse event in the healthcare system, the people receiving and providing healthcare are hurt and their relationships are affected. If this harm is to be adequately addressed and safety enhanced, well-being must be restored and trust and relationships rebuilt. Compounded harm arises when these human considerations are not attended to, resulting in shame, contempt, betrayal, disempowerment, abandonment, or unjustified blame, which can intensify over time. Oops, gone the wrong way. So we really started to think about why, how should we be working? Because what we were running into oftentimes is that we felt like we were working. We felt like the interests that were being the most protected were those of the system. And how did we bring this back to be more person-centered? And there's a lot of, work that's happening in the healthcare system that's really trying to hammer in on that person-centered care. But we had a really hard time getting there, moving the needle. And I think that a big part of that is the orientation of the systems, and I'll get into it a little bit later, but the kind of the legal frameworks that animate healthcare and how they kind of position us in ways that are antithetical to the relational ways that we're thinking and seeing that we need to work. So just in the context of healthcare, why is it important that we work in a relational way? And I think this really has to do with, the nature of care being relational. And the fact that the healthcare system is incredibly complex. And the more I'm in this space, the more I really recognize that. And I think that even makes it more important to have a relational orientation, particularly with respect to harm, because there simply are so many, there's so many factors and intersections and interacting systems. So it's been an interesting exploration. And this is lots of Jen's material in here. Thank you, Jen. She came and helped us with a workshop in Kelowna, which is nearby where I live, back in October. And it was a really great opportunity to just really think about what it is that we're trying to achieve with a restorative approach. So in thinking about how thinking about complex systems and what kind of a framework you would bring to a complex system that would make sense. Because we tend to work in really linear, kind of rigid, lots of silos, lots of, A to B, black and white in healthcare, like the framing, but not actually how work is done, right? So this whole idea of how is work imagined and how is work done. The frameworks haven't been working. So this is really an opportunity, I think, to reimagine a response and a framework that speaks to not only the relationality of people and what's required for our well-being, but also just the nature, that's how systems work, right? So the restorative approach, and again, it was really hard for me when I was putting this together and thinking about who's the audience, right? So I'm not sure how familiar some people are with restorative justice and a restorative approach, but really kind of the, at the roots of the restorative approach is that it's based in these relational understandings of human beings, and acknowledging the nature of relationships as being both profoundly healing and harmful, or can be either, right? That we really need to have good relationships to encourage that well-being and flourishing of all of us. And that healthy relationships are based on equal care, concern, respect, and dignity. And then again, this idea that we're not just talking relationships necessarily at an interpersonal level, but at the institutional level and at the social level as well. And this is, I always go back to this. I don't know how many times I said to Jen, this is brilliant. But these principles within a restorative approach that, when we're thinking about what it is, because, in thinking about restorative justice and a restorative approach, and I just have to say that in the context of healthcare, and I think there's probably others on the line who are familiar with this, but healthcare workers almost have an anaphylactic reaction when you use the term restorative justice in this space. And I think a lot of that has to do with the kind of positioning, like the victim offender. And because of the nature in healthcare with harm not necessarily being, it's very rarely intentional, right? So how do we kind of reframe this and make it make sense? So I love the restorative approach and thinking more broadly, right, about the ways in which we can think about systems change and supporting systems across, like the amount of kind of alignment, I think, that we need between systems if we're actually going to transform them, right? So this, the principles really help me when I'm thinking about ensuring that we're doing something that is restorative. So like if we're thinking about a new policy or a new process, that these would be the ingredients to doing that. So I won't go through them, but they're there for reference, and they do belong to this lab. And then again, this is just kind of thinking about the restorative approach as what informs the practices, strategies, policies, procedures, and processes. So in thinking about the restorative approach in healthcare, there is a lot of opportunity. I think that's really untapped. And I think part of my hopes in this talk tonight would be like a bit of a recruitment, because we really need some help. There's a lot of work here that needs to be done. But suffice to say, harm in the healthcare system with two things like adverse events. And this could be something, from a medication error to, a death, or this could, there's a full continuum that this can work on. The systemic racism piece, the toxic workplace, this idea again of like moral distress and burnout, bullying, hearing lots about that in the healthcare system, conflict resolution just in general. I think there's a lot of implications for like the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement as well, but also in terms of mental health. And we're seeing in a lot of kind of international jurisdictions where there's a real focus of bringing restorative justice into the mental health setting. In particular, we're seeing it happen a lot in Australia and in England, actually, one of the trusts in London, they have I think it's one of the first kind of restorative justice facilitators that's been officially hired in a role in a mental health unit there. And I have to say what we're noticing, and I think this will become more clear as we go through this presentation, but in our healthcare system in BC, and there are reasons I think that this is starting to happen because we're socializing this restorative approach in the healthcare context. But I've noticed that there's been quite a few new hires coming into the system that have restorative justice training, and that's been just interesting to see that that's being reflected in the hiring processes even. So in thinking about framing, and this is something that I came up against a lot in my harm event, because I couldn't understand why it was so difficult to get an apology. I couldn't understand why it was so difficult to come together to learn and to heal. The experience was very it was secretive, it was defensive, it was adversarial, it was all of kind of the textbook things that if you went and did your research on what harmed patients experience, this is quite textbook. And there's been a lot of work in a lot of jurisdictions to kind of look into why this is so problematic, but suffice to say that there's work being done in many places and spaces in trying to figure out how we attend to that. But the framing became very obvious to me that the framing was difficult because, you know, in the context of harm, when you're worrying about things like legal liability, which is huge in healthcare, and you have and it's big stakes. So there's the legal liability piece, there is the reputational kind of protective piece. And the way that the law is set up is, it separates people. So bringing people together is much more difficult in this space than it is to keep them apart. But really what we need is to be brought together. So that's been a real, how do we grapple with this, right? So this slide here is just really talking about like what shifts when you take it out of the retributive frame and you put it into a restorative frame. So how do we think about accountability, right? In a retributive frame, we think about it more about suffering and punishment. But in a restorative frame, that would look more like taking responsibility, right? And working collaboratively to repair harm. When we're thinking in a retributive frame, and this was really disturbing for me as well in my experience, was, like the harmed parties aren't the main focus, right? Like the conflict is really taken away from the parties, and it shows up in courtrooms and writing papers, and you almost feel like you're outside of what's happening. And I think that that's really problematic when what is required to heal is to be able to come together to, bring those people together and have that. But in a restorative frame, that's what we have. We do bring those people together and they play a central role, right? And then those who are implicated in a harm event are defined by their offense. And I think too, this has been really tricky in thinking through how we do this in the healthcare setting because of terms like that, like it's just the complexity of the environment makes it really difficult. But, when we're looking in the restorative frame, we're not defining people by their offense. We're defining people by what they do to attend to the incident, right? So taking responsibility, learning and changing, and all of the growing, all of those types of things. I'm just going to take a drink. But I think too, the legal creep, and a lot of my colleagues who are still working in healthcare will talk a lot about this. I mean, the amount of paperwork, and they call it a lot of CYA paperwork is happening, right? So we're taking people away from the bedside, away from being able to do what, you know, they need to do in the jobs that they came into in order to be a carer, and are now spending more time doing paperwork. So again, just to reinforce what we're saying here, this is why we think restorative responses are important, because they pay close attention to the context and causes of harm, which is super critical in healthcare in particular. Because I mean, if you've got a physician, for example, especially right now in an emergency room, and there's no staff, they can't meet baseline staff, maybe they don't have the equipment, you know, we just don't know what's going on. And then if it were to become a legal proceeding, that might, we are not looking at it in the same way as we would in a restorative process. Again, that we're thinking about everybody involved in the process. We're calling people in rather than calling them out. And this idea that what's happening at that micro level may have implications to larger things that are happening that we could be learning from, and to be able to do that and share. And one of the other problems that we face a lot in the healthcare context is the inability to share. Like it's, and that sounds crazy, but it's very guarded. There's lots of privacy legislation in all sorts of ways. A lot of people will argue that it's kind of weaponized. Some people would even say that it's, you know, they're perceived barriers rather than real barriers. But the fact of the matter is that there are massive barriers to learning in the healthcare context. So again, I'm sharing one of Jen's, well, this is from the Journey to Light, but it was really helping me to think about how do we move from, you know, these siloed and fragmented ways into moving into more accountability and holistic and comprehensive ways. And this was a really helpful infographic for me in thinking about the ways in which we move differently. Has my screen changed on your end? Yeah. Sorry, I've done something funny with this. That's gonna play from current slide. There we go. Okay, so and this signals the shift under this accountability to responsibility focus, when I really, the whole blame and liability piece, and you're wanting to get over to that, it's to how do we move forward in a good way rather than how do we apportion blame, right? And that seems to just be really, really difficult in the context of healthcare. Now, I just wanted to say too, and I've kind of missed my spot where I wanted to say this, but just in thinking about the why is it so tricky? It seems as though, so you have your, like in your healthcare system clearly is beyond just like a hospital system. But when we're thinking about the healthcare system and the components of that, you know, and you're having your, you know, your unions and your insurers and your medical protective associations and your professional regulatory colleges and all of these stuff, and they all work in kind of these within this retributive framework, and they're all trying to shift right now. At least in BC, we're trying to shift, but it's really difficult when you don't have that kind of alignment between different systems working in similar ways. So it's been a real challenge, but I think we have some good news. So here's some work that I think is really exciting that's coming up in this space. So as you can see, we've got a whole like Harmed Patients Alliance, for example, wonderful organization that's been founded by two lovely humans who both lost children in the healthcare system, and who are really they're really pushing this work forward in the United Kingdom. So that's just amazing to see. But we're seeing people like Professor Sydney Decker, who's just released a few months ago, Restorative Just Culture in Practice. So he is very famous in the healthcare context with this idea of creating a just culture, and thinking about how to do that in healthcare, because when harm was happening in healthcare, it was really hard to surface those events and for people to be really open and honest, because there was so much fear. And there was such risk, right? Punitive actions, sanctions, all of those types of things. And so he really kind of spearheaded this just culture, which was really meant to kind of create spaces where healthcare providers could come together and talk openly after there had been harm. This didn't always include patients, which didn't really, there's so many layers to this, but that's really a piece of it. But what kind of prompted this restorative just culture is this kind of recognition that you can't have a just culture in a retributive system. So there was a lot of work happening and trying to get to this just culture, but without that framing actually shifting and changing, it wasn't really accessible. So there's been a lot of new thinking in that. But lots of work happening. We had this event, this Reimagining Our Healthcare System. And what was really beautiful about this event that we had just this past October was that we came together with, so British Columbia we have a First Nations Health Authority, which is unique to BC, which is really cool. So we partnered with First Nations Health Authority and Interior Health Authority and the university to pull something together, which was just really kind of neat. And we could think about the restorative approach too with respect to First Nations people. And clearly that's where a lot of this kind of thinking has come from, right? Is credit to Indigenous knowledge, ways of knowing and being. And I will put a little plug here too, because there is an international symposium on restorative health systems that's coming up at the end of March, which will be kind of, I think the first, kind of health related restorative justice gathering meeting. And I'm happy to share the details for that if anybody's interested. But this is just to demonstrate that there is exciting work happening. And there's just so much space for anybody who's wanting to join in. I feel like I'm recruiting. So just so you're seeing kind of, I'll just some examples of what's happening here in BC that I think really we're starting to get a bit of a foothold, which I think is exciting. So this legislation was an amendment to the Health Professions Act and Occupations Act. And this just came out a couple months ago, I think just before the new year. But we're really starting to see language about, so this is, with respect to professional regulation. So we're starting to see restorative processes showing up in that legislation, which is great and huge opportunities there. We also have, so I have mentioned a while ago in plain sight report, and that was the report that detailed the Indigenous specific racism coming out of BC. So I can't quite remember how many recommendations came out of that report, but one of them was to look at the patient complaints processes for Indigenous people, First Nations people in British Columbia. So we came together in January of 2022 for a provincial dialogue day where we really sat together and tried to think of what needed to happen to this complaints process to make it more culturally safe, culturally appropriate. And one of the principles that was identified was to take a restorative approach. So this is just another document and another space that's showing up that kind of gives us some opportunity to really embed and move the work forward. So that is happening. We've got a few people now in BC who've actually managed to put the restorative approach into their job description, in quite high levels as well. You can see here, this is a summary of the presentation that Honorable Beverly McLaughlin gave to the Board of Directors of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of BC. This was, I think this was about, was it 2 years ago already? Sorry, I don't have a date. 2021, yeah. And we were also requested to do a presentation for them last summer. So they're really on a journey too, to like, what is this restorative justice stuff? How do we do it? How is it, implicated in our context? So there's lots of kind of exploring happening, I think, at this point, which is good and exciting. I'm not actually quite sure how long I had for this, but I am recognizing that time is getting on. So I just quickly want to go through this because in how we've been thinking about what contributions could a restorative approach make in this context. These were some we had a few years back, a convening and collaborating grant that came through the Michael Smith Foundation of Health Research in BC. And we came together to think about, with a big group of us, to think about what kind of opportunities and benefits there might be from looking at an approach like this in this context, in the context of healthcare harm. So oftentimes what's really difficult and was the case in my experience as well, is this, opportunity to have an apology, to think about the needs of all parties, which is something that oftentimes isn't, the system's just not set up to really look at the needs at the moment. This ability to tell your story is really important. And this promoting well-being, trust, to move in a quicker way. I think we're curious about whether this may be an upstream approach that actually reduces cost in the long term if we start working in more kind of relational ways. This much needed culture shift in healthcare, this big issue of systemic racism in our healthcare system. And then all of these, kind of colliding movements that are really tasking us to do things in a different way. This, the whole social justice kind of scene, there's so much synergy with the restorative justice piece. And then this idea that we can promote learning, if we can talk more openly between ourselves, then and share more openly, what could that do in terms of learning for individuals, organizations, and at the systems level. So just some of the things that we kind of have come up against when we're trying to kind of do some of this work and thinking about this work is, and I've mentioned this time and time again, I think already in this discussion, is the complexity of our healthcare system. This incredible risk-adverse nature in the system. Being able to engage all of the stakeholders, the nature of restorative approach being a voluntary process. So that's something just to consider as well. And the idea that, it doesn't work for everybody all the time. But yeah. So part of what we did when we meet this group of people was to put together key areas for research, right? Because it's what I found so challenging in the healthcare system is the record, because I'll be honest, I never intended to do a PhD. That was never something that I planned. But there was an aha moment at one point in time where I recognized that we had to have the evidence in order to make the change. And I tried to get other people to help me get the evidence, but that just wasn't happening. So in order for us to do that, then we need to do this research. So one of the things that showed up in that convening process was the conceptualizing piece, like how we're thinking of the restorative approach, restorative justice in the healthcare system, because like I said, the anaphylactic reaction of some healthcare workers, right? And thinking about, I cannot be characterized as a perpetrator, right? So that kind of victim offender binary was really disturbing for some people, and rightfully so. I mean, typically in this space, people aren't intending harm, so there are some contextual differences. This idea, this need to make the financial case, which always makes me crazy, but is clearly necessary. I know some of the struggles we've come up against, have to do with concerns from, say, the Ministry of Finance about what it looks like if we do this in a different way, and does it open up liability and all of those pieces as well. So then, the design and implementation, and it's so interesting because they're so, the language in healthcare, trying to marry the restorative language with the kind of healthcare language has been interesting, but, the design and implement, the evaluate and the spread, and then really understanding what are our barriers and what are our enablers. And there's clearly both in the system as it stands right now. So that brings me to the end, and I can't wait to hear somebody else's voice. So thank you all for listening.
Well, so the voice you get to hear first is mine, but not the only voice, for sure. So I want to start by saying thank you. Thanks for setting our minds alight and giving us lots to think about. I think I want to start off by and giving others a chance just to collect their thoughts, and then indicate that they have a question. I was struck. I'm always struck by new things when I hear you talk about what the potential is and what the kind of work is. And tonight I was struck by a few things that I wanted to ask you to say a teeny bit more about the shift. Why the shift might be significant and important in terms of our understanding of this complex healthcare system, what it requires. One was the very idea of professionalism as part of how the healthcare system has evolved and what it kind of relies on. So I am most struck when I seek care in the healthcare system by how quickly I need to trust people with my most sort of private, difficult, frightening, like a transparency about myself and my needs that doesn't come easily to me when I walk into most other professional people's offices. And that's been something that's really important to healthcare, particularly as it gets more complex, as it gets more specialized, as we don't know the doctor or don't have a doctor down the street who we otherwise knows us. We have to be transparent about who we are in a holistic way pretty quickly. And so I was today really struck by that slide where there's the shift from retributive to restorative that is about individual accountability. But there's something about if when things go wrong, we don't think about the harm to that trust in professionals who we trust and believe because they are part of a system, because there's a system that's checking they're okay and holding them to account and creating the conditions in which we can trust them. That the other significant shift that might be the next level on that slide is a move too from this individual accountability only to recognizing how inadequate individual accountability is without looking at the system or the collective, right? Because at least, I mean, for a whole bunch of reasons in this complex, messy healthcare system, but one of them that struck me tonight was about professionalism. And I've heard you come at that before in terms of thinking about the experience of professionals themselves within the system. and how hard and isolating that is when a harm happens and we can't deal with it in robust ways. So I wonder if, serving that up to you, you might talk to us a little bit about some of the thinking you've been doing about why this is important for the significance of professionalism, and also for those who occupy those professional roles.
I think it's such a difficult space, and hearing lots of professionals talking about being in that professional space. So I'm just thinking about a meeting I had a few weeks ago, and we were, so in this space, when I show up, I always have to show up in all of my vulnerability, right? Because that's the story. And in working with lots of professionals and thinking about vulnerability, oftentimes when we're talking about it, they're thinking about it in terms of professional vulnerability. Now I'm trying to make this make sense. So there are so many layers of protection on professionals, like from and so much identity tied to this, and what I think is being taught is less about connecting now than it ever has been, like at a really personal level. It's because the fear is so there, right? The risk aversion is so there, that it's difficult, I think, for them to show up unveiled, right? But the expectation is, and really, like, there's no option but to, in our case, right? Like coming in as patients. So just, you know, the shift is big. The shift is big if we're going to create those spaces that, you know, I mean, I think we're asking for things that could be seen as being quite simple, you know, like apologies or open disclosure, all of those things, but in a space that is this fraught, and in a frame that is this retributive. And even in thinking about, like, the colleges of physicians and surgeons, for example, there is a judge and jury kind of thing happening there. Like, it's an administrative body, you know, it is punitive in nature. It you know, is meant to, it's creating that adversarial positioning between the complainant and the physician. But like the ability to have, and I'm sure these restorative conversations clearly do happen. You know, there are physicians who will take it all off and, you know, and be vulnerable and have those conversations. And then I think those are the ones probably that don't show up in the formalized complaints process. But it is really fraught. It is really difficult for, you know, for them to do that because of all of those things. I'm not sure if I answered that question at all, Jen, but.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it does strike me, this relational shift is we've moved so far away from those kinds of relationships that we actually trade upon, right? That we took a shortcut to the relational work we used to do in healthcare, what provision happened in and within community and with people we knew. Professionalism was part of a shortcut to that, where we could, instead of building that trust, assume that trust.
Yeah.
But then we've started to see, and I think your description there about the impact that has on the shifting nature of healthcare providers as they've become professionals within a system more subservient to the risk in the system, and that it's separated them from those kinds of relationships they need to. So just, you know, one more sort of reason to think about, you know, that slide that says why a relational approach in healthcare is, there already is one. We're just kind of ignoring the ways in which those relationships have shifted. So I see a hand up from Renee. I'll keep track then of the of a speakers list, and look forward to hearing people's. I know that Ali will welcome your insights, your comments, your questions, any and all of the above. So I'll turn to you, Renee.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, thank you so much. I appreciate all of your insights. I'm here in California. So I'm glad to finally be able to partake in some of your informational settings. One of the comments that I wanted to sort of, with these discussions about healthcare and patients interactions, is understanding that what these healthcare institutions do have control of is their own culture. And so it's to try to pursue restorative justice with healthcare and patients and not address it with the workers when patients are actually coming into what may be a hostile work environment for some of us. I have my own experience where I'm having to deal with the environment, and then I have to turn around and try to give good care to my patients. And that's not sustainable. And you have younger people coming into the profession who no longer see it as a calling. I'm a nurse. It's a job. And if you are walking into a healthcare environment that's retributive and you have selective accountability for physicians who make money and this type of thing, it's starting to dawn on me, this is what our patients are walking into. And so healthcare workers have to compartmentalize, even though they don't feel safe in the environment, they have to try to provide safety. So I feel like going forward in the restorative justice movement, you can't uncouple work culture and patient safety. And so that's just my little contribution, that everything you say and are discussing, it happens here. But we also have to contend with that hospitals do have control over work culture. They can manage restorative justice in a less retributive manner. And I think it would be helpful to patient advocates to also promote that as well, because you have no idea what you're walking into or what that person has been dealing with when they meet you and they're trying to provide you care knowing they don't feel safe. So I don't know if there's been any discussion about that in the patient advocacy circles. Do you all address those types of issues when you're talking about patients walking into a particular environment? So I guess maybe that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renee. I absolutely love your question because this is something that we're talking about a lot. I mean, I think initially what happens is you get angry first. And I think that's where I was for a long time. And then I remembered my roots and what it is to work as a nurse. And then seeing the context right now is so bad. So yeah, and interestingly, I was asked to do an upcoming debate, which will be looking at what do we need to prioritize, patient safety or healthcare worker safety? And when I look at this, I think you really can't have one without the other. Like it's the whole, and even like and I'm not sure how many people would be familiar with the term second victim. Renee, you probably are. But there was a lot of work done around this. The second victim is a term that was coined by Albert Wu. I think it was back in 2002 when the patient safety movement had really taken off. And there was a lot of, people saying like, look, there's incredible harm happening in this healthcare system. What are you going to do for us, right? And the healthcare workers were saying like, look, we're victims of this too. So what's happened in that is, I think, a really unhelpful pitting against of like this vying for victimhood, right? Like who's the victim? I'm the victim, but we're the victims too. Where I think that's what needs to happen is we need to come together and say, yeah, we are all the victims of a really unhealthy system. And how are we going to come together and fix it together? And I think that's part of the power of this restorative approach as well, is like that's how you would do something like that, right? Like you you bring parties together to problem solve and to figure this out. But it's clearly a huge, massive issue there. But I do know some people in California who are working on the restorative justice and healthcare. So if you're interested, I'm happy to connect you.
Such a fascinating shift you just pointed to there, right? Which is if you start to look for harm, if our work becomes to look at harm, which is why I like the kind of term of looking at healthcare harm, you do start to move away from that zero-sum game of you can only find harm in one who is a victim, and then there must be an offender. That the complexity of this environment, the riskiness of giving care in the context of healthcare settings becomes much easier to sort of resolve. I like that. This is a false debate. Now I'm tuning in for that.
Yeah.
Looking forward to see how that debate goes. Other questions, comments? How is this landing? Jake McIsaac is signaling, and then Holly.
Yeah, I didn't know how to raise my chat hand. Sorry. Ali, thank you. Pulling a little bit from what Renee just said, I've heard parts of this before, but it was really helpful to hear it all together in this way. And I'm struck at how similar this is to police complaints, particularly around professionalism, the high harm, the risk. And so this is my question for you about some of the criticism I hear when we're talking about police complaints is that balancing this, what appears to be this private hidden away justice process that's good for the parties, maybe, that it's not to say that some good can't come out of it, and that folks build some understanding at that level, but then public interest, like, why are we doing this? Why does it matter more generally that we get this right, so that it can't only just be what's good for those folks? And how do we make sure that you talked about, some doctors are getting it, some folks, will sit down and have this conversation, but how do we make sure that the learning there gets captured so that we are all better because they sat down? So it's experienced as individual, it's experienced as something significant, so that the individuals don't get lost in this, but at the same time that, of course, we are all interested to make sure this goes well. Not sure if that makes sense.
It makes really good sense, and I am so struggling with the same thing. How do we capture the learnings? How do we capture when it's going well? And I think in a lot of these spaces, they're kind of covered in the privacy legislation, right? Like all of this stuff is that's so. I would actually think maybe this is a conversation for our fellows at the lab to be having, is how do we capture some of this that's happening in those spaces? Because I think we need to make the case as to why this is so powerful, and we hear about it anecdotally, but how do we really capture it and move that forward?
Can I just push you a little bit further to follow up on Jake's question, to say I think that's true in terms of how do we communicate this to the public, but how does this bring more people into, or can it, in ways that the other complaints processes seem to ignore all of the other people both affected and who have to know? And is that one of the things that become more possible in your horizon? And I will just say before you answer, I'm going to make a guess that the fact that we moved to daylight savings or whatever we did on the weekend is why people are joining exactly at 8:30. So if that's you, please be welcome to be part of the conversation, and know that we've recorded this as well. And so you can catch up on the part that you missed when we posted on the lab website. It just strikes me that some people do move the clock and others don't, and we are ones that do. And so we would have moved that back just exactly at the wrong time for this. Yeah. So
I think I'm picking up on what you're saying, Jen. And so just the nature of a complaints process, right, is formal and often rigid. Like, I mean, you're looking at most often written correspondence, right? Which is often kind of feels very legal. So the nature of this shift would I mean, I think there's a huge accessibility piece here as well, is bringing more people in a more accessible way, to and that opportunity to have context and dialogue and you know, demonstrate care and all of those pieces that you don't get in the kind of written correspondence that a complaint would typically look like, right? So it's just all around a completely different way of, you know, reimagined way of doing things, I think. I'm getting thrown off by all the people coming in too.
Yeah, I
It's
think
lovely. Yeah.
Renee asked this great question that triggered that for me immediately, right? Which was, if we only see the problem as the way that it presents itself, we lose the opportunity to bring people in who can provide insight and context about what is this working environment like, what is this what is this context like, who else knows things, who can help, who needs to be learning from this in ways that isn't just a public report, but this, like, to Jake's point, how are we going to build back public confidence if none of those people who are connected to this can be engaged and involved in contributing to the work of change?
And that's a huge issue right now, isn't it? Like this idea of public trust, and something we're thinking a lot about. And I know here in BC, and I should have mentioned it earlier, but they've just released 2 days ago, the Human Rights Tribunal, an inquiry into hate crimes. And one of the groups that was experiencing a lot of hate is healthcare workers. So there really is this, you know, issues all across the board to kind of contend with.
Jake, did you want to follow up with any further comment before I turn to Holly to make that connection, or you good? Holly.
Thanks so much, Eileen. Thanks, such a stimulating discussion and such important discussion. Look, I'm just going back to those ideas of professionalism and the therapeutic relationship that many of us are meant to have, and certainly, you know, this would be recognised by Renee as well. As a nurse, we're taught that this is a very privileged relationship, a relationship of trust. And in fact, the curriculum that we teach our students currently here in Australia is based on a Canadian curriculum and the theoretical framing of relational theory which supports restorative approaches. But one of the things that struck me is, you know, the discussion about harms. We've recently had an apology on behalf of the Council of Deans of Nursing and Midwifery for Australia and New Zealand for the harms perpetrated by nurses and midwives on our Indigenous populations. And to make it not an empty statement of apology, there's been actually changes to our national the codes of conduct and practice, and we're held accountable under our national law as a health professional. So there are structures and plans being put in place to make sure that we're publicly, individually accountable for our practice. So as I'm teaching my students at the moment, as a brand new student nurse starting, you know, this semester, their names are all held by the national regulatory authorities. So if a complaint comes from a patient, it can go directly through. They can have a look up on the national website to see where that person might come from, and we then become accountable for that student. And as I said to those students, they can look us up at any time. So if a patient says, "Look, Holly was a terrible nurse today," and she knows that my name is Holly Northam, then she can look it up and she can go, "Okay, I'm going to put in a formal complaint." And so there are processes that we're trying to instigate so that those layers of governance are starting to connect with those ideas of trust and relationship. But I think, you know, there's so much obviously that has to be done. You know, 70% of sentinel events are communication failures It's so, this is the work that we're trying to do. But these restorative approaches that you're working on are so important. And my final comment is there's a great example in Wanganui Hospital when there's a formal complaint. The family, each month the family are invited up to present to the board as to what their problem was, so that they're hearing that voice at the uppermost levels of that hierarchy to actually hear the voice and be accountable. But thank you so much for your work.
Thank you, Holly. And I think and I just appreciate, because Holly's doing this work in Australia. And I think there's some really amazing work that's happening through First Nations Health Authority here too. And we can't capture it, right? Because it's that whole piece around privacy again. But I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the professional regulators. And I was in a meeting, a couple of weeks ago, and there was some discussion about so again, our context is right now a real big focus on Indigenous specific racism in our healthcare system. And so some of the health authorities, the CEOs have made some very, very powerful kind of commitments to we will not tolerate Indigenous specific racism in our healthcare system. And if, should you do that, there will be consequences. And so again, I was a little bit like, okay, this is a good start, but how does this position us? So again, we're, what is racism? And so people are feeling like that, but we don't know what it is and what kind of consequences and what does this look like? So we've just got so many layers, I think, of issues and thinking about that kind of entrenched, polarized positioning and the retributive aspect of it that I think it's going to take us a long time to untangle and try to figure out. Yeah, like Jen said, right? Can't cheat the grind. So.
Others who have questions or comments about things that have landed for you, Donna.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the last thing you said, Allie, that this effort to try to change the culture and try to change the system is a punitive kind of effort. Exactly, I would think, contrary to actually having a transformative kind of change, right? Who's gonna admit or examine their own behavior with so much at stake. But I wanted to ask you something that may sound like a technical question, so forgive me, maybe it's the lawyer in me. But how are you thinking about avoiding liability? What are the technical kinds of moves that you anticipate or that you see in some processes where a medical professional could make a statement that, were it offered in a court of law, would be a statement that would admit liability and that could cost them and perhaps their employer a great deal of money. So what are the technical ways you're doing that? And this is obviously an issue for many restorative justice practices, certainly including in the criminal system as well.
Yeah, so I think in Canada, we're in early days, right? But I think a lot of this work has been done actually in the US. And some of the findings that they came out with were, if you can offer up an apology quickly, be transparent, all of those things, the likelihood of there being litigation was incredibly lowered, right? So and it often upsets me that that's the reason, that the lever that we have to pull in order to do what's right and what's good is to look at the financial piece, but it absolutely is. It's there, right? The other interesting thing that has really helped in the New Zealand context is they have a no-fault system of legal liability, or a no-fault system of medical liability. So there isn't that same fear to work with respect to the liability. So I think the compensation piece is something that we're going to have to grapple with, because it's, you know, there's no doubt that there are people who are harmed who do require some sort of compensation, but to a large degree, litigation seems to be something that's undertaken when people can't get that resolution, when they can't get those answers, when they don't have the transparency, when they don't have the apology. So I think there's, I mean, it's a work in progress, but it has been a lot of work. Now, in the US, they're using a lot of those communication and resolution programs. Is that familiar to anyone? I wondered whether Renee, it might be familiar too. So, and that's happening in a couple hundred hospitals across the US, where they're, you know, they're like proactively offering compensation. Whether when they're responding to harm very quickly. I think they have kind of a 24-hour window where they're supposed to disclose, and it needs to be fulsome, and all of those pieces. But just different models and different things, I think, that can enable that. But New Zealand is having some success, I think, as a result of their no-fault system.
Interestingly, aside from the no fault, so I'm just going to give you a door open to talk about some of the technical. So we've seen some stuff happen under the guise of apology legislation, and the lack of submission of that as an admission of fault. So I think there's kind of some coverage, like some safe space created to be able to do this work in ways that doesn't imperil people. You're having another kind of experience in BC, where you're starting to think about the capacity to build feasibility studies, and this, what might otherwise be quite harmful to patients that you mentioned, because they're left out of this Evidence Act provision. That means that that's supposed to create this safe space, which is only used for doctors and healthcare physicians. But do you want to say a little bit about what kind of a runway to satisfy Donna's and my geeky interest in how it is that lawyers can be kept at bay so that good work can happen, or how they can be supportive of creating frameworks in which good work can happen without people being liable? Do you want to say a little bit about that as one other example?
Yeah, it's so the legislation that Jed's referring to is our Evidence Act in British Columbia. It's Section 51. Sometimes we call it Area 51, just to joke. But the way it's what did they call it? Quality assurance legislation, and it's supposed to be to create a space for healthcare providers, you know, physicians, to come together to talk openly about what has happened, but to also be able to, like, you know, have opinions. So it's not all fact-based, but they create these committees, these Section 51 committees, and whatever is disclosed in that committee cannot be compelled, or, you know, disclosed to patients. It can't be compelled in a litigation. So when we've been thinking through, because this has come up as a roadblock for us, right? And in terms of how do we bring people together, and how do they get that fulsome information? So we had thought about perhaps we could bring a patient into that committee, and that they would be bound by the same types of, you know, confidentiality that the other physicians and other healthcare providers are in, and whether that might be a space and create some safety to facilitate those types of conversations. So that's where we're kind of trying to explore right now, and thinking about, like, how we can do this and how we can create those safe spaces so that everybody can participate, and working with the other insurers as well, and the protective associations, to try to figure that out.
Yeah, and that's clearly a transitional thing, but we're watching that happen in terms of where is there restorative space within settlement privilege in litigation, whereas there are provisions that could be modeled, where you can create a restriction on the use of the information that might be shared within these processes to their purpose in those processes, rather than to litigation, and sort of trying to find some creative solutions to transition, because I loved your other answer, which is, well, it turns out that if people would participate, their faith might lead them to see this as less of a risk than they think it is, right? The risk of liability versus is actually diminished, and what people need, they get more earlier, but you got to get people into it over the hurdle of fear for that kind of transformation of our thinking and justice work to happen. And so I think that's it is an interesting puzzle about where the law might be able to be used in its current place, rather than as a barrier, but as some space to try to do this work. But what are the impacts on doing it that way, to the nature of the work? Others, we probably have time for one more question or comment, or an insight that might benefit us in this conversation. Yeah, Lisa.
I guess what strikes me, Jake mentioned a similarity between police complaints. I see similarities when the restorative approach in schools was rolled out here in Nova Scotia, and the teachers positioning themselves afraid of blame, and would not engage in if something had happened in a classroom and they either had stepped out and should have been there, or they were giving them a free period when administration maybe wouldn't have seen that as appropriate. And I guess from a larger view, I think what this says about us as a society and how we position ourselves, and then again, how supportive all the work that everybody's doing in all the systems might eventually create some space for a cross-pollination, if you will, and an openness, perhaps, one can hope.
I just appreciate that hopefulness. I share it with you. And that's what I see too, is I didn't ever suspect that when I started kind of muddling around in this space, that it would really, that the law, the legal process would be so implicated in the healthcare space. And the more and more, you see all of these cross-pollinizations and interactions and intersections, and yeah, we can't just do this work in one space. I think this is the kind of that societal transformation that you speak about.
So I'm going to ask everybody to stay just when we stop the recording for a minute, but for those who will go back and watch the recording, and that we have the benefit of this wisdom and this conversation as one of the seeds that can support growth in lots of places, can travel as we hope the community expands. As you said, you're recruiting more people into the conversation so that we can do more and more of this transformative work that you've set for yourself and challenged us to be part of. I just want to express my sincere appreciation, not only for tonight, but for the work that you do, for the care that you take in terms of doing it from a place of care and a place of passion, and a place that calls us to be part of that transformation in terms of healthcare, and what we need from one another and what we can support.